Right now, the world is watching the wrong thing. You turn on the news and you hear about new tariffs, advanced microchip bans, and billions in frozen sovereign assets. The mainstream media is telling you that the American blockade is tightening. They want you to believe the grip is secure. But as a professor who studies the structural mechanics of global power, let me tell you what they are completely missing. The blockade hasn't just leaked. It has entirely structurally failed. And almost no one in Washington or London has the courage to admit it. We are all asking the wrong question. The question is no longer, is the United States successfully isolating its geopolitical rivals? The real question, the dangerous question is, who actually gets isolated when you weaponize the very foundation of global trade? For the past 5 years, the US attempted to build an impenetrable wall, to cut off oxygen, critical technology, and capital from its adversaries. They thought they were choking the system into submission, but instead they triggered a hidden mechanism, something absolutely irreversible. By squeezing the choke points of the global economy, they forced the sudden, violent creation of a shadow architecture, a parallel global system that the West can no longer see, dictate, or control. And this is where things get incredibly serious, because what looks like American geopolitical strength on paper is actually the exact blueprint for systemic collapse. To understand how this happened, you first need to see exactly what the mainstream gets so disastrously wrong. Every night, the financial press parades the same tired statistics. They show you lists of sanctioned oligarchs. They show you export controls on high-end semiconductors. They point to the SWIFT banking system and say, look, we have locked them out. The target is bleeding. But here is the deeper point. They are measuring success using an entirely obsolete map of the world. Washington evaluates its blockade based on compliance within the traditional Western-led financial system. If a sanctioned entity cannot use dollars or a rival tech firm cannot buy American silicon, Washington immediately declares a strategic victory. That is a fatal miscalculation. It is the equivalent of a landlord changing the locks on a building, completely unaware that the tenant has already poured the foundation for a massive new city right next door. The mainstream media assumes that being exiled from the US dollar system equates to immediate economic death. They assume the American financial system is the only oxygen source in the room. This is the illusion of compliance. Half a decade ago, that might have been true. But geopolitics, much like physics, absolutely abhors a vacuum. When you weaponize a currency, a semiconductor, or a shipping lane, you do not erase the underlying demand for global trade. You simply force that trade to mutate. You force it into the shadows. The blockade did not stop commerce. It merely blinded the West to how and where that commerce is now happening. The old metrics are completely dead. And this brings us to a terrifying geopolitical concept, a structural dynamic that Western strategists entirely failed to anticipate, but one that is quietly rewriting the global order as we speak. It is a phenomenon I call the inversion trap, and once it is triggered, no empire can easily reverse the damage. There is a foundational rule in the architecture of global power. The moment you weaponize a monopoly, you set the irrevocable countdown to its destruction. I call this the inversion trap. It is the hidden mechanism tearing the American blockade apart from the inside. And it is brilliant in its ruthless simplicity. For decades, the United States controlled the ultimate geopolitical choke points. They commanded the dollar clearing system, the SWIFT financial network, and the foundational patents for global technology. They were the undisputed toll collectors on the only bridge in town. If Washington did not like your geopolitical posture, they simply lowered the boom. They barred you from the bridge. For a long time, this was a flawless, bloodless weapon. It forced total compliance because the alternative was immediate economic starvation. But the inversion trap triggers when a dominant power squeezes those choke points too hard, against too many massive adversaries simultaneously. When you lock a major economy, or an entire coalition of resource-rich nations, out of your system, they no longer have a choice. Primal survival instincts kick in. The agonizing pain of being exiled forces them to absorb the immense upfront cost of building a parallel bridge. And here is the crucial, devastating part that Western strategists completely missed. Once that parallel bridge is constructed and operational, the original choke point permanently loses its leverage. The power of the US dollar or American microchip dominance was never just in their utility. It was in their inescapable exclusivity. By relying on blockades, tariffs, and sweeping sanctions as their primary foreign policy tools, Washington accidentally subsidized the research, development, and integration of its own replacements. They quite literally forced their fiercest rivals to become entirely self-sufficient. They thought they were starving their enemies. Instead, they forced them into a geopolitical crucible. They forged a hardened, sanctions-proof coalition that no longer needs Western permission to breathe, to trade, or to innovate. The inversion trap has finally snapped shut. The grand monopoly is fundamentally broken. But to truly and fully grasp the sheer scale of this colossal failure, you cannot just look at theoretical frameworks. You must urgently look at the physical, undeniable infrastructure that has quietly replaced the Western order. You need to examine the shadow nervous system that was constructed right under Washington's nose, because when you see the actual mechanics of this new machine, it changes absolutely everything. Step out of the abstract theory for a moment. Let me show you what this shadow nervous system actually looks like in practice, right now, as we speak, because the sheer scale of this parallel architecture is staggering. First, look at the financial plumbing. When the West severed Russia and others from the SWIFT messaging system, they expected immediate cardiac arrest. Instead, we witnessed the rapid acceleration of alternative clearing systems. China expanded its cross-border interbank payment system, or CIPS. Nations began aggressively trading in local currencies, yuan, rubles, rupees, bypassing the dollar entirely for bilateral energy deals. Central banks in the global south quietly began hoarding physical gold at the fastest pace in modern history. They were systematically de-risking their economies from American financial weapons. Then, look at the physical movement of energy. The West imposed price caps and maritime insurance bans, attempting to starve their adversaries of oil revenue. The result? The instantaneous birth of the largest shadow fleet the world has ever seen. Right now, hundreds of aging, unregistered tankers are sailing the oceans dark. They operate without Western insurance, without Western tracking, and without Western permission. They transfer millions of barrels of crude oil ship to ship in international waters, moving energy from sanctioned producers straight to energy-hungry industrial giants in Asia. The maritime blockade did not stop the oil. It only removed Western oversight from the global energy trade. And finally, look at the technological wall. Washington banned the export of advanced microchips and the machines needed to make them. But instead of technological surrender, this ignited a domestic renaissance within rival nations. They established massive, state-backed smuggling routes through third-party countries in Central Asia and the Middle East to secure immediate supply while they completely rebuilt their internal infrastructure. More importantly, they poured unprecedented capital into legacy chip manufacturing and domestic fabrication plants. They accepted short-term friction to guarantee long-term sovereignty. This is not a temporary workaround designed to wait out the storm. This is a permanent, structural divorce. The global supply chain has split into two distinct ecosystems, and the United States has effectively blindfolded itself to half of the world's commerce. But this is where the geopolitics must come down from the clouds. Because you might be thinking, Professor Jiang, this is fascinating global strategy. But how does this impact me? This is the part nobody is warning you about. Because the failure of this blockade is not just a problem for politicians in Washington. The true cost of this structural collapse is about to be charged directly to your bank account. You are about to pay the ultimate price for an empire's arrogance. Every time you buy groceries, fill your gas tank, or try to secure a loan, you will feel the devastating shockwaves of this failure. Let me explain exactly why. Let me be very clear. The global financial architecture does not split in half without someone paying the bill, and that someone is you. The politicians who designed these blockades will never admit the direct correlation between their failed geopolitical strategies and your collapsing standard of living. But the math is entirely unforgiving. When the United States weaponized the dollar and fractured the global supply chain, they permanently destroyed the era of cheap goods and low inflation that the West has enjoyed for 40 years. Think about the shadow system I just described. When nations are forced to build parallel shipping routes, alternative financial clearinghouses, and redundant technology factories, global efficiency dies, frictional costs explode, and who absorbs those costs? The end consumer. You are currently paying a massive, invisible geopolitical tax on almost everything you buy. When the West attempted to blockade the world's largest energy and commodity producers, they fundamentally rewired global trade. The commodities did not disappear, they simply bypassed the West and flowed directly to rising industrial powers in the East at a steep discount. This means rival nations are now manufacturing goods with cheap, sanctioned energy, while Western factories and consumers are forced to pay a devastating premium for the exact same resources. That is why your utility bills are skyrocketing. That is why the cost of raw materials, food production, and basic manufacturing is remaining stubbornly, violently high. This is not temporary inflation. This is structural, geopolitical inflation. But the deeper problem is even more dangerous. As the global South accelerates its trade in local currencies, the global demand for the US dollar slowly contracts. For decades, the American empire exported its inflation to the rest of the world because everyone needed dollars to buy oil and trade goods. As that mechanism breaks down, those dollars will eventually come home. What does that mean for you? It means higher interest rates for longer. It means your mortgage becomes unaffordable. It means your car loan doubles. It means the purchasing power of your savings is structurally hollowed out to finance an empire's debt. This is the ultimate consequence of the inversion trap. By trying to lock the world out, the United States has inadvertently locked the costs in. They have sacrificed the economic security of their own middle class on the altar of a failed geopolitical containment strategy. And if you think this is a uniquely modern phenomenon, you are gravely mistaken. History provides a flawless, terrifying mirror for exactly what happens when an empire tries to isolate the world only to isolate itself. We have seen this exact architectural failure before, and the final results are always catastrophic. Let me show you why. Let us step back for a moment. If you study the lifespan of global superpowers, you will notice a terrifyingly consistent pattern. Every dominant empire, at the precise moment it begins to decline, attempts to use blockades and embargoes to freeze time. They always believe their market is the center of the universe. Look at the early 19th century. Napoleon Bonaparte controlled almost all of Europe. In his arrogance, he created the Continental System, a massive, continent-wide blockade designed to completely starve the British economy. He banned all trade with London, assuming that cutting them off from French-controlled markets would force their immediate surrender. But what actually happened? The inversion trap snapped shut. Instead of suffocating, Britain simply bypassed Europe. They aggressively expanded their trade networks into the Americas and Asia. Meanwhile, the nations trapped inside Napoleon's blockade suffered massive inflation, resource shortages, and economic collapse. The blockade did not destroy the target. It hollowed out the empire that built it. Smuggling became the dominant industry. Sound familiar? The United States is currently repeating Napoleon's catastrophic structural error, but on a digital and financial scale. Washington genuinely believed that exiling nations from the dollar and American technology was the equivalent of exiling them from Earth. But just like 19th century Britain, the targeted nations simply looked elsewhere. They built the shadow fleet. They built the parallel financial architecture. When you study history, you realize that a blockade is rarely a sign of an empire's strength. It is almost always the ultimate symptom of an empire's desperation. It is the frantic reaction of a power that can no longer compete on manufacturing, innovation, or diplomacy, and must resort to coercion. History proves that once this parallel system is fully operational, the original empire never regains its monopoly. The damage is permanent. The world permanently bifurcates, which brings us to the most critical part of this analysis. Because if the historical pattern holds true, and it always does, we are no longer guessing about the future. The math is already written. Let me give you 3 exact, undeniable predictions for what is going to happen next. Now that the inversion trap has fully closed and the historical parallel is undeniable, what exactly happens over the next 36 months? Let me be very clear. This is not speculation. This is structural inevitability. Here are my 3 precise predictions for the immediate future of the global economy. Prediction number 1, the complete, irreversible fracturing of global commodity pricing. Watch the energy and critical mineral markets closely. Over the next 2 years, the Global South will aggressively accelerate the pricing of marginal oil, natural gas, and rare earth metals outside of the US dollar. We are not just talking about Russia or Iran anymore. We are talking about major, previously neutral players in the Middle East and South America permanently adopting local currency settlements. The dollar will not collapse overnight, but its monopoly on global energy, the very foundation of its strength, will bleed out in 1,000 tiny, irreversible cuts. Prediction number 2, the technological boomerang. By placing sweeping export controls on advanced semiconductors and legacy chips, Washington forced its rivals to achieve self-sufficiency a decade ahead of schedule. Within 36 months, you will see Chinese and allied technology firms flooding the Global South with cheaper, entirely sanction-proof alternatives. Western tech giants will suddenly find themselves permanently locked out of the fastest-growing consumer markets on Earth. The blockade designed to suppress foreign innovation will actually finance the absolute destruction of Western market share. Prediction number 3, the escalation of secondary sanctions and the final break. As Washington realizes its primary blockade has failed, panic will set in. They will begin heavily sanctioning third-party nations, countries like India, Turkey, or Brazil, simply for interacting with the shadow system. But instead of forcing compliance, these aggressive secondary sanctions will act as the final catalyst. It will push the unaligned world entirely into the parallel financial architecture just to survive. The blockade will aggressively expand until the United States successfully isolates nobody but itself. These 3 massive structural shifts are already unfolding right before our eyes. But there is a final, darker reality to this systemic failure. Because while aging empires play these grand games of financial architecture and maritime choke points, there is a brutal reality at the very bottom of the pyramid. The New World Order is not just written in trade ledgers. Let me show you the ultimate, haunting human cost of this entire geopolitical tragedy. When empires play these grand games of financial war, it is never the elite architects of the blockade who starve. It is always the ordinary citizens standing on both sides of the wall who suffer. In the West, it is the middle class paying the ultimate price, watching their life savings quietly evaporate into the structural inflation of a fractured world. In the Global South, it is millions of innocent people forced to navigate the punishing, everyday friction of a deeply divided economic planet. This entire geopolitical tragedy was born from a profound, fatal arrogance. Washington genuinely believed that the world simply could not survive without its explicit permission. They believed their system was an unchangeable law of nature rather than a temporary historical privilege. But history does not care about American exceptionalism. It only cares about leverage, survival, and the ruthless physics of supply and demand. The inversion trap is entirely unforgiving. We have finally crossed the Rubicon. The shadow architecture is no longer a shadow. It is rapidly becoming the new undeniable center of global economic gravity. The American blockade did not stop the rise of a multipolar world. It subsidized it. It accelerated it. It absolutely guaranteed it. And now, the West is standing alone behind its own magnificent, impenetrable wall, desperately clutching the heavy iron keys to a financial kingdom that simply no longer exists. You are watching the end of a unipolar era. It is not happening through a dramatic military defeat, but through a quiet, devastating structural suicide. I am Professor Jiang Xueqin. Share this profound analysis with anyone who still blindly trusts the mainstream narrative. And please prepare yourselves for what inevitably comes next, because the world is never, ever going back to the way it was before. Thank you for watching this broadcast today.